In my decades within the halls of Parliament, I have witnessed both the necessity of change and its terrible dangers. The great question that haunts every statesman is this: how do we preserve what is valuable while correcting what is defective? Too many reformers, intoxicated by abstract principles, believe they can rebuild society from its foundations. Yet experience teaches us that such attempts invariably destroy more than they create. The French Revolution stands as a monument to this folly. A nation that sought perfect justice through total destruction achieved only chaos and tyranny. True reform requires a different method entirely, one that works with the grain of human nature and honors the accumulated wisdom of generations. This is not mere conservatism for its own sake, but the highest form of political prudence. Today, as America faces calls for radical transformation of its institutions, the principles of genuine reform have never been more urgent to understand. Chapter 1: The distinction between revolution and reform. The fundamental error of our age lies in confusing revolution with reform. These are not merely different degrees of change, but entirely different species of political action. Revolution seeks to destroy existing arrangements and rebuild society according to abstract principles. Reform, by contrast, works to perfect existing institutions by removing their defects while preserving their essential character. Consider the stark difference between the American Revolution and the French. The Americans, though they broke with Britain, sought to preserve their ancient liberties as Englishmen. They reformed the imperial relationship but maintained their constitutional traditions, their respect for property, their religious institutions, and their social fabric. The French revolutionaries, however, declared war on history itself. They abolished the monarchy, destroyed the church, confiscated property, and even attempted to remake the calendar. The result? America developed into a stable republic, France descended into terror, chaos, and eventual despotism. The American example proves that even the most dramatic political changes can follow reformist principles when they build upon existing foundations rather than destroying them. The colonists did not invent new theories of government. They appealed to the ancient Constitution of England, to the rights of Englishmen established over centuries. Their revolution was, paradoxically, a conservative act. They sought to preserve liberties that the mother country was threatening to destroy. This distinction explains why some changes strengthen society while others destroy it. Reform respects the complexity of human institutions, understanding that they have developed through countless adjustments to meet real human needs. Revolution treats these institutions as mere obstacles to be swept away in favor of some theoretical ideal. The reformer asks, how can we make this work better? The revolutionary asks, how can we replace this with something perfectly rational? Experience teaches us that societies are not machines that can be dismantled and reassembled according to blueprints. They are organic entities, growing through time, shaped by countless circumstances, needs, and adaptations. To destroy them rashly is to lose knowledge that cannot be recovered, relationships that cannot be rebuilt, and wisdom that required generations to accumulate. True statesmanship requires the delicate art of preserving while perfecting, of honoring the past while adapting to present necessities. Chapter 2: The Wisdom of Tradition as Living Knowledge. Critics often dismiss my defense of tradition as mere prejudice or blind attachment to the past. This misunderstands entirely what tradition represents. Tradition is not dead custom but living knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced challenges similar to our own and discovered what works. When I defend the importance of prescription and long usage, I am not arguing that old things are good simply because they are old. Rather, I am recognizing that institutions which have survived the test of time have proven their utility through the most rigorous examination possible, actual human experience across generations. They have been tested not in the abstract realm of theory, but in the concrete world where human nature reveals its true character. Consider the British Constitution, which the French revolutionaries scorned as an irrational patchwork of ancient customs. Yet this irrational system had produced a level of liberty and prosperity that the rational French Constitution could never achieve. Why? Because the British Constitution had evolved through centuries of practical adjustment. Each generation had preserved what worked while gradually reforming what did not. The result was a system perfectly adapted to the actual needs and character of the British people. This is what I mean by the wisdom of tradition. It represents not the accumulated prejudices of the past, but the accumulated solutions to the permanent problems of human society. How do we balance liberty with order? How do we maintain authority while preventing tyranny? How do we encourage prosperity while preserving justice? These questions have no purely theoretical answers. They can only be resolved through the patient work of generations, each building upon the discoveries of their predecessors. The revolutionary impulse to sweep away all existing arrangements and start fresh is therefore not boldness but folly. It discards the laboriously accumulated solutions to human problems in favor of untested theories. It treats the wisdom of ages as worthless compared to the clever schemes of a single generation. This is not progress but regress, a return to the state of savagery where each generation must solve for themselves problems that civilization had already resolved. True progress occurs when we understand tradition not as a constraint but as a foundation. Just as a wise builder does not tear down a sound foundation to build a new house, but rather builds upon that foundation to create something better, so wise reformers build upon the institutional foundations their ancestors have provided. They preserve the wisdom of tradition while adapting it to new circumstances. This does not mean that tradition is infallible or that all existing arrangements are perfect. Rather, it means that we approach inherited institutions with humility, seeking first to understand why they developed as they did before presuming to alter them. We recognize that apparent irrationalities may serve purposes we do not immediately perceive, and that seemingly outdated practices may embody insights that remain valid. Chapter 3: The Art of Prudent Judgment in Political Action. The essence of political wisdom lies not in following rigid principles, but in exercising prudent judgment that considers circumstances, timing, and human nature. This is perhaps the most difficult art in politics, for it requires abandoning the comfortable certainty of abstract rules in favor of the complex task of practical wisdom. Throughout my parliamentary career, I have observed that the greatest political failures stem not from bad intentions but from good principles applied without regard to circumstances. The attempt to govern India by the same methods suitable for governing England, the effort to tax America without considering colonial conditions, the French attempt to create perfect equality through legislative decree, all these disasters resulted from treating politics as a matter of pure logic rather than prudent adaptation. True political judgment requires what I call the moral imagination, the ability to see complex situations in their full human context rather than as abstract problems to be solved through formula. When we debated the American crisis, those who insisted on rigid enforcement of parliamentary supremacy were not wrong in principle, but they failed to exercise the imagination necessary to understand how principles must be adapted to circumstances. Consider my approach to the American taxation question. I did not argue that Parliament lacked the right to tax the colonies. Such a position would have been constitutionally indefensible. Instead, I argued that exercising this right under current circumstances would be imprudent, unjust, and ultimately self-defeating. The question was not what Parliament could do legally, but what it should do wisely. This distinction between legal right and prudent action is crucial to understanding the Burkean method of reform. We do not change laws simply because we have the power to do so, nor do we preserve them simply because they exist. Instead, we ask, what serves the genuine good of the community? What honors both justice and prudence? What preserves valuable relationships while correcting genuine abuses? Such judgment cannot be reduced to rules or formulas. It requires deep knowledge of human nature, careful attention to particular circumstances, and the wisdom to balance competing goods. Most importantly, it requires humility, the recognition that our understanding is limited and that unintended consequences often follow even well-intentioned actions. This is why I have consistently argued that the science of government is a practical science, requiring the same kind of accumulated skill that we find in other complex human endeavors. Just as we would not trust a surgeon who had studied anatomy but never operated on a patient, so we should be wary of political reformers who understand theory but lack practical experience of governance. The prudent reformer therefore approaches change with what I call cautious amelioration. Rather than attempting comprehensive transformation, he identifies specific problems and addresses them through carefully designed remedies. He tests changes on a small scale before applying them broadly. He monitors results and adjusts his approach based on actual rather than theoretical outcomes. Most importantly, the prudent reformer recognizes that all human institutions are imperfect and that the goal is not perfection but improvement. He seeks not to create an ideal society but to make existing society work better for actual human beings with all their limitations and contradictions. Chapter 4: Property, Economic Freedom, and Social Responsibility. The question of property rights lies at the heart of any sound approach to reform, for property represents not merely individual wealth but the foundation of social order, personal liberty, and economic prosperity. Yet property must be understood not as an absolute right divorced from social responsibility, but as a trust that carries with it moral obligations to the broader community. My experience with the East India Company taught me much about the dangers of treating property as mere possession without accountability. When Warren Hastings and his associates treated the revenues of Bengal as their personal wealth, divorced from any obligation to the welfare of the governed, they violated the fundamental principle that property is a social institution serving broader purposes than individual enrichment. This does not mean that property rights should be weakened or that we should embrace the leveling schemes of radical reformers. On the contrary, secure property rights are essential to human flourishing. They provide the foundation for individual independence, family stability, and economic growth. They ensure that people can enjoy the fruits of their labor and plan for the future with confidence. They create the incentives for industry, innovation, and investment that benefit society as a whole. But property rights, like all rights, exist within a framework of social relationships and moral obligations. The owner of great estates has responsibilities to his tenants, his community, and the broader social order that protects his property. The merchant who accumulates wealth through trade owes obligations to the society that maintains the laws, infrastructure, and institutions that make commerce possible. This understanding of property as social trust provides the key to sound economic reform. We need not choose between the extremes of unregulated capitalism and socialist leveling. Instead, we can pursue policies that strengthen property rights while ensuring that property serves its proper social functions. Consider the question of trade regulation, which occupied much of my attention during the American crisis. The mercantile system that sought to control all colonial trade for the benefit of British merchants violated sound economic principles and created unnecessary conflicts. Yet complete free trade, without regard to political relationships and social consequences, would have been equally problematic. The prudent approach recognizes that economic policy must serve political ends, the maintenance of just and stable relationships between different parts of the empire or nation. Economic freedom should be maximized within this framework, but it cannot be treated as an end in itself divorced from broader social goods. This principle applies equally to domestic economic policy. We should encourage enterprise, innovation, and the accumulation of wealth, for these serve the general good by increasing prosperity and providing resources for both private charity and public purposes. But we must also ensure that economic activity remains subordinate to social and moral ends. The reformed approach to economic policy therefore rejects both the rigid controls of mercantilism and the abstract theories of laissez-faire economists who treat the market as a self-sufficient system requiring no social or political framework. Instead, it seeks to create conditions where economic freedom can flourish within a structure of sound laws, stable institutions, and shared moral understanding. This requires careful attention to the particular circumstances of each society. The economic policies suitable for a commercial nation like Britain might not work for an agricultural society like Ireland. The regulations appropriate for established trades might stifle new industries. The key is not to apply universal formulas but to understand how economic institutions can be adapted to serve the genuine needs of particular communities. Such adaptation requires the same kind of prudent judgment we apply to political reform generally. We must understand existing economic relationships before attempting to change them, test reforms carefully before implementing them broadly, and always remember that the ultimate goal is human flourishing, not economic efficiency as an abstract ideal. Chapter 5: Religion, Moral Order, and the Foundations of Free Society. No question has caused me more grief among my political associates than my insistence on the vital role of religion in maintaining free society. Yet experience convinces me that religious institutions and religious sentiment provide the moral foundation without which political liberty inevitably degenerates into license and social order into chaos. The French Revolution provides the most dramatic illustration of this truth. When the revolutionaries declared war on the Catholic Church, confiscated its property, and attempted to replace Christian worship with the cult of reason, they destroyed far more than religious institutions. They undermined the moral sentiments that make civilized society possible. Without the restraints of religious conscience, political power became purely arbitrary, justice became mere vengeance, and liberty became the freedom to oppress others. This does not mean that I advocate religious tyranny or the suppression of legitimate religious differences. My defense of Catholics in Ireland and my opposition to the Test Acts demonstrate my commitment to religious liberty properly understood. But religious liberty is not the same as religious indifference or hostility to religion as such. A society that treats religion as purely private matter, with no public role or social significance, undermines the very foundations that make religious liberty possible. Religion provides what human reason alone cannot supply, a sense of transcendent purpose that moderates human pride and ambition. When people believe that they are accountable to divine judgment, they exercise power more moderately and accept suffering more patiently. When they believe that earthly life has ultimate meaning only in relation to eternal purposes, they are less likely to sacrifice everything for temporary political goals. The established church, properly understood, serves as the guardian of this moral sentiment. It does not coerce belief, but it maintains in society a visible reminder of transcendent purposes and moral obligations. It provides a check on the tendency of political power to become purely secular and therefore purely arbitrary. It preserves the moral education of the people through its teaching and example. Critics argue that establishment violates religious liberty and creates hypocrisy. But properly functioning establishment does neither. It does not prevent other forms of worship or compel participation in established religious ceremonies. It simply ensures that society as a whole acknowledges its dependence on divine providence and its obligation to eternal moral law. The alternative to religious establishment is not religious freedom but religious chaos. When society has no common moral language or shared understanding of transcendent purpose, public discourse degenerates into mere conflict of interests. Political argument becomes impossible because there are no shared principles to which we can appeal. Justice becomes whatever the strongest party can impose. This explains why the American experiment in religious liberty has been more successful than similar experiments elsewhere. America maintained the substance of religious establishment while abandoning its formal structure. American society continued to acknowledge divine providence, maintain Christian moral education, and expect public leaders to demonstrate religious conviction. The First Amendment prevented the establishment of particular denominations, but it did not create a secular society indifferent to religion. The key to sound reform of religious institutions is therefore not to weaken their social role but to purify it. We should remove the corruptions that make religion serve merely political ends while strengthening its capacity to provide moral guidance and transcendent purpose. We should eliminate religious persecution while maintaining social recognition of religious truth. We should protect minority religious rights while preserving majority religious culture. This requires the same careful balance we seek in other areas of reform. We must understand that religious institutions, like political institutions, have developed through long experience to meet real human needs. We should not lightly disrupt arrangements that have provided social stability and moral guidance for centuries. Yet we must also recognize that religious institutions, like all human institutions, are subject to corruption and abuse and require periodic reformation. The goal is not perfect religious institutions but functioning religious institutions that serve their proper social role while avoiding the extremes of both tyranny and indifference. Chapter 6: Federalism, Local Governance, and the Management of Diversity. My painful experience with the American crisis taught me that even the most extensive empire must respect the principle of local self-governance if it hopes to maintain unity without tyranny. The attempt to govern distant communities according to uniform rules made in the imperial capital inevitably produces the very conflicts it seeks to prevent. True political wisdom lies in understanding how unity can be preserved through diversity rather than uniformity. The American colonists did not rebel against British authority as such, but against the attempt to exercise that authority in ways that violated their local traditions and institutions. They had governed themselves for generations through colonial assemblies that, while acknowledging imperial authority in external affairs, maintained control over their internal concerns. When Parliament attempted to tax them directly and regulate their internal trade, it violated this established arrangement without offering any compelling justification. The tragedy is that this conflict was entirely unnecessary. A properly functioning imperial system could have maintained British authority over external affairs while allowing colonial control over internal matters. Such an arrangement would have strengthened rather than weakened the empire by harnessing colonial energy and loyalty for imperial purposes while respecting colonial autonomy in local matters. This principle of federal governance applies with equal force to domestic political arrangements. Large nations cannot be successfully governed from a single center according to uniform rules. Different regions have different needs, different traditions, and different circumstances that require different approaches to common problems. Attempting to impose uniformity destroys the very diversity that gives large societies their strength and vitality. Consider the differences between England, Scotland, and Ireland within the British system. Each has its own legal traditions, religious arrangements, and economic conditions. Attempts to force uniformity upon them, such as the effort to impose the English religious settlement on Ireland, have consistently produced conflict and resentment. Success comes from recognizing legitimate differences while maintaining overall unity of purpose. The American federal system, whatever its imperfections, represents a remarkable achievement in this regard. It allows different states to address local conditions through their own institutions while maintaining sufficient central authority to preserve union and handle common concerns. This arrangement satisfies both the human need for local self-governance and the practical necessity of unified action in external affairs. Such federal arrangements require what I call imperial thinking, the ability to distinguish between those matters that require uniform treatment and those that can safely be left to local determination. External defense, foreign relations, and interstate commerce clearly require central authority. Local education, religious arrangements, and most aspects of civil law can safely be managed locally according to local preferences and conditions. The key insight is that political unity does not require cultural or institutional uniformity. Indeed, excessive uniformity often weakens rather than strengthens political bonds by destroying the intermediate loyalties that connect individuals to the larger whole. People are more likely to support a distant government if it respects their local institutions than if it seeks to replace them with centralized bureaucracy. This federal principle also provides the key to managing religious and cultural diversity within free societies. Rather than seeking to eliminate differences through secularization or cultural homogenization, wise policy allows different communities to maintain their distinct traditions while participating in common political institutions. This requires tolerance and mutual respect, but it preserves the social diversity that makes free societies dynamic and creative. The reformed approach to governance therefore seeks to maximize local self-determination consistent with maintaining necessary political unity. It recognizes that good government must be adapted to local conditions and that distant bureaucracies, however well-intentioned, cannot effectively manage the daily concerns of diverse communities. It preserves central authority for those functions that genuinely require it while devolving everything else to the most local level capable of effective action. This approach requires considerable political skill and judgment, for the line between local and central concerns is not fixed but must be adjusted according to changing circumstances. But it offers the best hope for maintaining free government in large and diverse societies. Chapter 7: Applying Burkean Wisdom to Contemporary American Governance. As I observe the current American political scene from this temporal distance, I see both encouraging signs of institutional resilience and troubling symptoms of the very diseases that destroyed free government elsewhere. America's constitutional system embodies many of the principles I have long advocated, yet it faces challenges that require the careful application of prudent reform rather than either radical transformation or stubborn resistance to all change. The American Constitution represents perhaps the most successful attempt in human history to create a written framework that preserves the benefits of traditional governance while adapting to new circumstances. The founders understood that they were not creating a perfect system but a workable one that could evolve through experience while maintaining its essential character. The amendment process, the federal structure, and the separation of powers all reflect the kind of prudent constitutional design I have always advocated. Yet the current polarization of American politics threatens to undermine these very achievements. When political parties treat constitutional questions as mere partisan weapons rather than matters requiring careful deliberation, they weaken the shared commitment to constitutional government that makes democratic competition possible. When each side seeks not to persuade but to dominate, the essential spirit of free government begins to die even while its forms remain. The solution is not to abandon partisan competition, which is natural and necessary in free societies, but to restore the constitutional culture that makes such competition constructive rather than destructive. This requires what I have called the spirit of accommodation, the willingness to recognize legitimate interests on all sides and to seek solutions that preserve essential principles while addressing genuine grievances. Consider the current debates over federalism and the proper role of national versus state government. These echo the very questions that led to the American crisis in my own time. The key insight from that experience is that such questions cannot be resolved through abstract constitutional theory but only through careful attention to practical consequences and the preservation of constitutional relationships. When federal authority expands beyond its proper sphere, it weakens the local institutions that provide the foundation for free government. Yet when state authorities refuse to acknowledge legitimate federal concerns, they threaten the union that makes local freedom possible. The prudent approach seeks to strengthen both levels of government by ensuring that each operates within its proper sphere while cooperating where necessary. Similarly, current economic debates often suffer from the same false alternatives that plagued economic policy in my era. The choice is not between unregulated markets and socialist control, but between economic arrangements that serve genuine human flourishing and those that serve only abstract theories or special interests. This requires the kind of economic statesmanship that considers long-term social consequences rather than merely short-term efficiency or equality. The question of religious liberty in contemporary America also reflects themes I addressed throughout my career. The challenge is not to eliminate religion from public life, but to maintain space for religious conviction while preventing religious coercion. This requires understanding that religious liberty means freedom for religion, not freedom from religion, and that a society hostile to religious faith undermines the moral foundations that make political liberty possible. Perhaps most importantly, contemporary America needs to recover what I have called constitutional reverence, not blind worship of constitutional text, but deep appreciation for the constitutional tradition that has preserved American liberty for more than 2 centuries. This means approaching constitutional questions with the humility to recognize that the founders' wisdom was tested through experience, not merely theoretical speculation. Such reverence does not prevent constitutional development but guides it. Changes should build upon constitutional foundations rather than replacing them, should address genuine problems rather than theoretical imperfections, and should preserve the essential character of American constitutionalism while adapting it to new circumstances. The greatest danger facing American constitutionalism today is not any particular policy disagreement but the loss of constitutional culture, the shared understanding that constitutional government requires mutual forbearance, respect for established procedures, and commitment to persuasion rather than coercion. Recovering this culture requires not constitutional amendments but constitutional education and the cultivation of constitutional virtue among both leaders and citizens. This is the ultimate lesson of the Burkean approach, that free government depends less on perfect institutions than on the cultivation of civic virtue and practical wisdom among those who operate those institutions. Conclusion. The method I have outlined throughout these reflections offers no quick solutions or revolutionary transformations. It requires patience, wisdom, and the humility to work within existing institutions while gradually perfecting them. This disappoints those who seek dramatic change and frustrates those who resist all change. Yet it alone provides hope for preserving what is valuable while correcting what is defective. The choice before any free society is ultimately between the prudent path of reform and the destructive path of revolution. Revolution promises everything and delivers chaos. Reform promises only improvement and achieves lasting progress. The former appeals to human pride, the latter requires human wisdom. The former destroys to rebuild, the latter preserves to perfect. In our age of rapid change and ideological passion, these distinctions have never been more important. The temptation is always to choose between extremes, either to embrace every innovation or to resist all change. True statesmanship lies in the difficult middle path of prudent adaptation. This requires not just good intentions but practical wisdom, not just noble ideals but careful judgment, not just the courage to act but the patience to act well. The preservation of free government depends upon our willingness to choose this harder but more reliable path.